children were into something. Good morning. Good to see you. My name is Dale Hubbard. I am privileged to be here with you today. How many of you were not able to sleep last night just in anticipation of this section? Can I see your hands? Okay. All right. There's a passage in Revelation 21 that covers that, I think. But anyway, we'll not get into that. This will not be, in any stretch of the imagination, the most exciting thing that you're going to do while you're at Memphis School of Preaching. But I really hope it is something that will impact you in a very positive way for the entirety of your work in preaching. I'm seeing one. I'm looking for, can I see the wives' hands here? All right, 1, 2, 3, 4. Did that word get out that we were encouraging wives to come? Sometimes we don't. Okay, all right. So I'm assuming one or two things from the fact that there are a multitude of you and only 4 wives. I'm assuming the rest of you are not married, or you told your wife not to come. So no, I'm just kidding about that. It is good. I don't know. I think, are y'all recording this? I don't know. Yes, you are recording this? Okay, good. It would be helpful, seriously, for them to be able to look at it at some point in time. I'll give you just a tad of background as to why I am or am not qualified to talk to you about these subjects this morning. Grew up in the church. My dad was a bivocational preacher. I went to a junior college and then to the University of North Alabama, got my degree in accounting. Having lived in a preacher's home growing up, I wasn't sure I wanted to preach or not preach or that kind of thing. Started preaching my junior year in college at a little place. And then for most of my career, I've done local work as well as secular work as well. Smaller congregations, sometimes not so small congregations, but so I understand from your vantage point both the preaching side, and then in 1980-something, I purchased a tax and accounting practice, began to do taxes for all kinds of folks, began to do taxes particularly for preachers, and over the course of that time probably did 100+ preachers working with churches, and found out that preachers are very unique in the tax side of it. And so that's what we're going to talk about kind of in the second section today. The first session I want to talk about is I want to talk about just some money, some principles, financial investment principles, and things of that nature. That's really going to be important as well. I do want to make one comment or at least mention something to you. How many of you attend congregations or are preaching for congregations currently either in Tennessee or Kentucky? Tennessee or Kentucky. Okay. All right. Are you familiar with the estate that Brother Comer left several years ago? Some of you are shaking your head yes. And the reason I'm saying that is this good brother left about $35 million in a trust. And any congregation, at least to my understanding, any congregation that is a cappella in its music, and basically one or two very simple questions, can be a beneficiary of that trust somewhere in the neighborhood of $17,000, I think. Are any of you associated with congregations that have received that money? You are?
We haven't received the money, but we sent in the information.
Okay, you sent in the information. Have you received the money yet?
Well, where my father preaches, they have. Well, I don't think they've received the money, but they have sent it out there.
Okay. And the only reason I say that is because the deadline passed, I believe, in November, but they are extending the deadline to 2/29. So what is that? A week from tomorrow. So if you know of congregations in Tennessee or Kentucky, please let them know about this. I've got a phone number. I've got an email address here if you want to get that later on. But please get them to contact that, because there are really no strings attached to this, from everything I understand. You fill out a very simple application. Was talking with a guy at lunch this week. They had done that, and you fill out a very simple application. And which congregation couldn't use $17,000? If you have one that can't, let me know. I know somewhere $17,000 could go and be a good use. So want to encourage you in that. All right, so this morning, preachers and money. Preachers and money. And here's kind of the format we're going to do this. I'm not terribly structured to the point where I can't take questions at pretty much any point in time. So you've got 2 or 3 options in regard to questions. If you have one while we're talking, raise your hand. Be happy to address it then. We're going to take some breaks. If you want to ask a question during the break, that'll be fine. If you want to write it down and give it to me, that will be fine. Let me give you my cell phone number for this or for future reference. 256-606-1758. 256-606-1758. You're welcome to text questions to that number. So I want to provide information, but I also want to answer questions as well. Money is one of those things you just have to deal with. There's no choice. There's no option in the society that we live in, the way that we live in it. And so I want to give you a baker's dozen of things this morning, and you're welcome to write it down. You're welcome to take notes. You're welcome to sit and listen and say, hey, text me and say, hey, can I have a copy of that PowerPoint? And I'll be happy to send that to you as well. But some things in regard to money, because you're doing the greatest work in the world. You're doing the work of sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. And because you're doing the greatest work in the world, when you go to the grocery store and buy your groceries, you say, I'm a preacher, and they give you the groceries free, right? No grocery stores like that? You put on your power bill application, hey, I'm a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And they say, yours is free, right? You go to the car dealership and you say, I'm a preacher and I'm going to use this vehicle for good, and I'm going to use this vehicle to share the good news of Jesus with others. And they say it's free, right? And they just hand you the keys. It's the same thing with everyone else. And so while your focus is upon sharing Jesus with other people, this is an area that you really want to do well. It's an area that you want to, and I don't know if excel is the right word or not, but it's an area that you want to be a good example. And it's an area that can be very troublesome if you don't do well, if you don't take care of finances. All right, let me get a quick check. How many married in here? How many don't have bosses? That means unmarried. Okay. All right. So finances can be very stressful. Been there, done that. And if they are stressful, it's going to impact everything in your life. It's going to impact your preaching. If you're married, it's going to impact your marriage. It's going to impact your emotional well-being, your physical well-being. And so the things that we're going to talk about this morning are things that I hope will help you to where you can keep the financial section in a manageable order so that you can focus. So that if you're laying down at night and you wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's not about how I'm going to make the car payment. It's about that good person that you met with that day, that you studied the gospel with, and that's trying to make a decision to be obedient to the Lord, and you're praying about that. You don't want this to be a troublesome area in your life. It requires maintenance. It requires effort. It requires planning. It will not take care of itself. And the better maintenance, the better planning, the better efforts that you put toward it, the better you're going to be in that arena. Everything starts at the same place in life, in finances, and just stays that way the rest of the time, right? No, it didn't work that way. You may not be married. You may get married. You may not. I knew a couple pretty neat preachers in the New Testament that never married, so that's okay. You may marry, and then you have children. How many in here have children? All right. How many plan to have children? All right. So good. They come free, right? They just give them to you. You go to the hospital and they're free. One of the things, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. We're going to talk about health insurance and the importance of that. Lack of good health insurance can cause significant financial problems for you. But you have children. Now, 2 children are as cheap as 1, right? Wrong. Sometimes it's more than even the multiplication factor in things that go in that nature. Your children are going to grow and they're going to get older and they're going to have more financial needs, correct? If they grow long enough, and you hope they do, they'll get driver's license and they'll need cars, and then they'll go to school and go to college, and there's just a lot of things. And so live for the moment is not the best philosophy for finances. And so one of the things that we want to really encourage is stay in current. Stay in current not just with what's going on, but stay at current even in the planning stage. So here's your baker's dozen. Number one, it all belongs to God. Be a good steward. Be a good steward. It's His. We accommodatively say mine. We accommodatively say my car, my money, whatever. That's accommodating. It's His. And as a steward, and by the way, I want to ask you to do something personal for me. Would you please add to your prayer list a man by the name of John? The Lord knows who John is. Had lunch with him yesterday. He is a wonderful gentleman, a very sincere gentleman, and is very spiritually minded. I gave him a copy of Muscle and Shovel, and I hope that he'll read that book because I believe he's a man that wants to do the truth and wants to do what's right. But we were talking in that lunch just about stewardship and keeping that in the forefront of our minds, the stewardship of our time, the stewardship of our ability. You're here because you want to be a good steward in part of your ability to share the good news of Jesus Christ with others, but also a good steward of our talents in the financial arena. I call it 0 plus something equals 0. You say, wow, is that the new math? How'd you get that? What did we bring into this world financially? Nothing. What are we going to carry out? Nothing. And so why do we get all wrapped up in stuff in between? Well, in part because we have to deal with it. I currently work as a financial advisor. And so along with preaching for a local congregation near Moulton, Alabama. But it's about money a lot of the hours of my day. But it's a different perspective for me because not all my clients are members of the church. But with every client I work with, I try to encourage good stewardship. Good stewardship because you and I know one day we're going to give an account, not just of our words, not just of our action, but of our financial stewardship. So I need to be reminded. I need to remind myself. I need to gently remind others about stewardship. As you preach, that'll be a topic you'll hopefully speak on quite often. We need to use to the best of our ability and our time and our money. Because as you preach, you're going to become a counselor. And by counselor, I don't necessarily mean a certified counselor. I love those folks. I love what they do. But as people gain trust in you, as they gain trust in you, they're going to come to you. And that's a sign. That's a good sign. When someone comes to you and says, "Can I talk to you about something?" That's a plus. That means you've earned some trust with them. Because normally when people come to talk to you and want to talk about something, is it something good or is it something they're struggling with? It's often something they're struggling with. Now, one of the things that you want to encourage the members where you preach, you want to encourage them to bring the good stuff to you too. Hey, when something good happens in your life, I want to know about it. When something good happens to your kids, I want to know about it. When you have a good Bible study, I want to know about it. When you did something good at work that's God related, I want to know about it. Sometimes I don't want to say overlook, but there's a passage that says, "Rejoice with those that rejoice." I want to know everything good that I can know that's going on in the lives of my family, my spiritual family, my friends. Those are good times to rejoice. Now, what you may have to do is temper that a little bit. If something good happens and they remember it at 3 o'clock in the morning and they call me, "Hey, you told me anytime something happened good to tell you, so I just want to tell you about that." Oh, that's nice. Maybe 6 or 7 or 8 would have worked a little bit better. But when they come with things that they're struggling with, hey, I'm struggling with this, I'm struggling with that. You're going to be a counselor in that sense. And just some very basic financial things, because that happens. It happens in many lives. Most marriages at some point in time have battles or struggles in the financial arena. And so if you've got something to give them, if you've got something to encourage them, if you've got just some basic things, and I would encourage you to put something on paper, and maybe it's pulling some of this right here, or maybe 3 things or 5 things, and say, this is what has helped me, and I hope it'll help you. And kind of number one is it belongs to God. I want to be a good steward. Before I stick that piece of plastic in that little thing that takes my money away from me, am I being a good steward? As I make out the budget, am I being a good steward? As I want to do impulse buying, am I being a good steward? And I'm not saying any of those things are wrong. It's just the umbrella. It's the overall captivity of my mindset. Finances is about two things. It's about mindset and it's about behavior. And so it's hard to have good behavior and finances when I don't have the right mindset. So I'm building that foundation that says it all belongs to God, be a good steward. Number two, it's so simple, but it's so challenging. Spend less than you make. If your outgo exceeds your income, your upkeep's going to become your downfall. That's not original with me, but it's pretty good. Spend less than you make. It's too easy, isn't it? It became too easy when they gave us plastic. It became too easy when you can go online and in 30 seconds you can buy more than you can pay for in 3 years, right? Or 3 months or whatever. And so it all fits together for the Christian. I want to please God. Does God want us to have nice things? What do you think? I think of all the people in the world that God won't have nice things, it'd be Christians. I just really believe that. If I'm wrong, y'all can correct me. But He also wants us to do that within a framework. We don't have to have the best of the best of the best of the best. We're going to talk a little bit later about contentment. But spend less than you make. Kicking the can down the road financially often ends up in the ditch. And so make sure that that's a priority. Number 3, pay God first. Pay God first. You may be scratching your head going, whoa. What do you mean pay God? I utilize or use this one in regard to contribution and how that we financially give to God first. There's a theme. There's a theme throughout the entirety of Scriptures that God deserves the first fruits. If you go back and you study the sacrificial system of the Old Testament, never once can you find where God says, just go do whatever you want to do, as long as you want to do it and how you want to do it. If you have anything left over, I'll be glad to take it. First, at the front, at the top, we'll talk about budgeting. And as you, think about budgeting, that's the first line item. We have instructions. You've preached them. You've shared them. You will do that more. Not grudgingly, cheerfully, not of necessity, willingly. My gift, my financial gift to God. Obviously, my life, the living sacrifice, Romans chapter 12. But financially as well, because there's so many things. There's so many things that can't happen without finances. Memphis School of Preaching could not exist without money, without the generosity of brethren and congregations. And oh, by the way, congregations are made up of brethren. And so put God first. I'm a little older than most, probably all of you. And being older has its pluses and has its minuses. Somebody's amening over here. So, but one of the pluses is that you get to have a lot of experiences and see and hear and understand things. There's a gentleman that probably none of you ever met. You'll meet him in heaven one day. But he was just a country gentleman. He was an elder for many years in the church. And when Jesus talked about salt and light in the Sermon on the Mount, I'm not sure he didn't have this gentleman in mind. It was just the kind of gentleman that he was. He sold cars on the side sometimes, and I remember buying vehicles from him. And he was so trustworthy. You know, used car salesmen don't generally have a real high rep, right? But he sold cars, and I would go and I would say, Brother William, here's what I've got. It's probably wore out by now. Here's what I've got. And I would look on his lot and I would say, you know, give me a price on this one and this one and this one. And whatever you think the trade value is, or you tell me what I would owe you. and I will purchase it at that price, no haggling. I trusted that man that much. And I never, ever even came close to feeling like he didn't treat me fairly. And I say that not to talk about trading cars, but I say that because I didn't hear it personally, but I heard it, I think it was from my dad, that one day he was struggling financially. And this has been several years ago. And he was having some issues financially, and he went to the bank and he borrowed some money. You say, well, that's what you do sometimes. You just go to the bank and you borrow money. But here's the kicker. He took the money he borrowed and gave every penny to the Lord. Every dime of that money he borrowed, he gave to the Lord. And he later recounted with joy, that was the easiest money I ever paid back in my life. I'm not telling you to. I'm not telling you not to go to the bank and borrow money and give it to the Lord. I'm just saying, put God first. Put God first in the financial sense. It's the seed concept. It's the seed process. God can take what we do and multiply it so many times. I don't know what people do. I don't know how they are come up to or get the amount that they put in. Probably all of us that have ever served or waited on the table, as we sometimes call it, passed the collection plate around. It seemed like there were folks who were just kind of scrambling. Let's see, they were going through their billfold or going through their purse. What have I got? It doesn't sound like it didn't seem like, tried not to judge, but it didn't seem like there was a whole lot of purpose there. But in your life, in your family's life, there's a purpose. And the first purpose goes to, I'm going to put God first. Secondly, which is number 4, that's not conflicting, pay yourself second. We're talking about arranging an order here. We're talking about prioritizing here. And paying yourself second, put some money into savings of some sort or another. When we buy things, we buy them hopefully in a good condition, maybe brand new, and nothing ever happens to them. They never tear up, they never quit, they never break, right? Vehicles, washing machines, furniture, computer, pretty much everything that we ever purchase is on a downhill slide after that. And something's going to happen to it at some point in time. And so we'll talk about emergency funds a little bit later. But as you're plotting, planning that budget, pay yourself second. How many of you, when you get through here, this is going to be your first preaching job? Let me see your hands. All right, a lot of you. You're probably going to go to a place that has a couple thousand members and is going to pay you $250,000 a year, right? Probably not. Probably not. Now, if you do, good for you. But that's probably not. Where do you normally start when you do something for the first time? You start at the bottom. That's not the worst thing to do unless you're a well digger. But it's not bad to start at the bottom. But when you start at the bottom, you're probably not going to be making as much money as you might hope or as you might like, or certainly as much as you're going to be making down the road. And here's what is a temptation, and here's what's a danger. And we're going to talk about in the other section, we're going to talk about how to set up agreements with churches and whatever. But don't ever take a job you can't afford. Don't ever take a job. What do you mean? Don't ever take a job that the financial aspect is not a doable situation. I've watched that happen. It's not good. It's not good for you. It's not good for the church. And you may love it. You may say, hey, this is my dream church. But if the financial end of it can't make the ends meet, if they can't allow you to do the things that we're going to talk about this morning, the end is ultimately going to be disaster. I don't know how long now. The initial time that I was associated with Memphis was before it came to Forest Hill. And I was so blessed. A good friend of mine, Ronnie Hayes, preaches for the Adamsville Church. And Ronnie graduated from the school. And he said, come up to the lectures with me one day. And I said, sure, great, love it, it's good. And so before the open forum, Brother Elkins was still alive at that time, and he was going to be speaking at the open forum. And before the open forum, Brother Cates, who was still living at the time, Ronnie had mentioned me to him and said, hey, come up here and tell them a little bit about what you do with your tax service for preachers and things like that. I'll give you a couple minutes and just talk to folks. I could never in a million years have bought that kind of advertising. But before I did that, I was sitting there beside, I'd never met Brother Elkins, and sitting there beside him, and such a kind, such a gentle man. He had that ability. I was just a young whippersnapper, but he had that ability to make me feel like greatest person on the earth, just talking a couple minutes, had never met me. So through Brother Elkins and through Brother Cates and Brother Ronnie Hayes and others, I began coming once a year. At that time, it's usually every couple years now, but and talking to the students here, and got to know students here, and got to work with them in taxes and things of that nature. And I've seen the good, I've seen the bad, I've seen the ugly. I've seen guys go out and say, I love this church, and I love it, and I think it's going to be great. It's going to be a really good fit. And my concern always is for the fit, okay, spiritually, doctrinally, how's the fit going to be, and how do you think that's going to work, and do they have elders, do they not have elders, how's that going to work? But invariably someone would say, but there's just not very much money, and I don't know if I can do this, and it's going to really be tight. There's a difference between tight and won't work. There's a limit to how many sacrifices that you can make. There's a limit to what you can cut. And so as you're planning and as you're figuring, as you go into these situations, if you can't pay God first, if you don't have room to pay yourself second and be able to put some things back, we're going to talk about emergency funds and things like that, I highly urge you to reconsider, because it likely is not going to get better. And I love small churches. Most of the places I've preached have been small churches. I love those, so I'm not saying anything negative in regard to that. But they have limits too. They have limits to what they can do. And they may be doing the very best that they can do, but it still may not be enough. It makes a difference if you're single or if you're married and you have 4 children. That's a different budget. That's a different number. It makes a difference if you're single and you plan to marry, because most of the congregations don't do this. They don't say, brother, when you came, you're single, and now you're married, we're going to give you a $25,000 raise. That'd be nice if they would. And there are some that do considerations in general in that way, but they're working on a budget as well. So what you're looking to do here as you're creating this financial game plan is you're saying, okay, God, you're going to get the first fruits, regardless of whatever else is going on. And secondly, I'm going to set aside some savings. I'm going to get an emergency fund. We're going to talk about retirement funds later on. But the unexpected will always happen at the most unexpected time, right? And it seems like the time when things are the tightest is when the washing machine and the dryer and the transmission all go out the same week. And it's like, wow. Or if I'm in better shape, why do they keep running? Well, maybe the Lord's trying to teach them. I don't know about that part. But make sure that you have something in there for savings. Because who else is going to save for you? When's the last time you just been walking down the street, somebody said, hey, here's $100, put in your savings? Or some of the brethren just come and say, hey, here's some money for savings. Brethren are going to be great too, but it's our responsibility on that particular thing. Number 5, keep a good emergency fund. Keep a good emergency fund. You'll probably have to build that up. Some of you that already are married may have one. I hope you do. How much is it? I don't know how much yours ought to be. Here's some considerations. How old are the appliances? How old is the house that I live in? What are some things that could break, tear up, whatever? What is my deductible on my health insurance? What's the most out of pocket I could be if I had to have emergency surgery or things of that nature? Those are some things to factor in. Is it $1,000? Is it $5,000? Is it $10,000? Is it $50,000? I'm not going to try to tell you what yours needs to be. I'm going to tell you you need that cushion. And that's a hands-off cushion. That's not one of those where I'm going to go borrow out of my emergency fund this week and then I'm going to pay it back next week. Why is that not a good idea? Because next week the dryer tears up. Oh, well, okay, it's the next week I'm going to put back in. That's the week the transmission goes out. Well, the next week, the kids got to go to the dentist, and all of a sudden we had 73 cavities and we didn't know it. So there's always something. It is a hands-off fund, and it's treated just for that, just for emergencies or just for whatever you've plotted that to be. Now, you're doing, I said this before and I'm repeating for emphasis, you're doing the greatest work in the world. But there's not always certainty within what you're doing. When you go to work for a congregation, they're probably going to sign you to a 40-year contract, right? No. They're not even going to sign you to a 40-day contract. I don't say, we have many good folks in the brotherhood, and I don't say this negatively, but I say it because you need to hear it. You are one sermon away from unemployment at any time. You are one good sister's feathers ruffled from unemployment at any time in certain situations. And so what makes sense is a couple of things. Number one, and we're going to talk about agreements in the other section, but number one, make sure you get a good written agreement in place about how you part ways. Because you're going to part ways. And you'll part ways either on good terms, bad terms, or somewhere in between. How many of you know any preacher that began at one congregation and stayed there the rest of his preaching tenure? I don't know one. I know guys that have been places 20 years, 30 years, 40 years away, but I still don't know a single one that started in one place and stayed there the rest of their preaching tenure. So you know you're going to leave. You know at some point in time you're going to change. Now, it may be on your terms. It may be on their terms. That's the reason it's important to get that in some writing or whatever. I've seen, known, you've seen and probably known, guys that Saturday night everything's fine. Sunday night they're looking for a job. No severance pay. If they're living in a preacher's house, they may have a week, a month, whatever to get out of that. Things were fine, so they weren't out sending out resumes. It's hard to call on Monday morning somewhere and have a preaching job located by the next Sunday, right? So here's an expanse of time I may need to be prepared for that I will not necessarily have income coming in. And so I'm going to, as a preacher, factor that into my emergency fund. If I have to live a month, if I have to live 2 months, if I have to live 3 months until I can find that place. Because you really don't want this scenario. All of a sudden I'm out of a place. I'm in a real big hurry to find another place. I jump out of the frying pan into the fire and I grab the first thing that comes along because I'm in financial straits. And 2 months later I'm like, why in the world did I do that? And then you're in a miserable situation. And so again, I don't want to paint the picture negatively. Far and away, our brethren are good, things are good. But we need to be prepared. That's the reason we buy insurance. We need to be prepared. That's the reason that we provide emergency fund insurance. So that if bad things happen, we're not caught off guard. We're not put in a bad situation. So keeping an emergency fund and adding to that if you can. Get to the level where you're comfortable. It may be that your emergency fund right now is at $5. Well, that's $5 better than nothing, but I'd probably try to build that up. And you plan that into, factor that into what you're doing. Number 6, don't shortchange your family on health insurance. Don't shortchange your family on health insurance. Don't shortchange your family on health insurance. Did I say that 3 times? Okay, I meant to say that 3 times. We have a lot of wonderful things in our country, government, and other things. But there are also things that are in a mess in our country And I really don't know of a lot of things that are in a lot worse mess than health insurance. And it costs. It costs to go to the doctor. It costs to go to the hospital. All of those things cost. And those costs are completely out of a realistic balance when it comes to services and payment. Because literally thousands and millions of dollars get written off of hospital, doctors' offices, emergency rooms, books every month. Why do they get written off? Because people don't what? Pay. So what you have is here services that were provided that people didn't pay for. Well, the staff and the supplies and the rent and all that has to be paid for. So guess who has to pay for that? The people that are paying. How are they paying? Most of them are paying through insurance. So, and I don't mean to get off on a tangent here, but your insurance and my insurance is significantly higher than it should be because we're not just paying for ours, we're paying for other people as well. It's kind of like if you go to Walmart. A part of every item that you buy, a portion of that is attributed to an increase because people do what? Steal. They shoplift. And so we're paying a premium. Now, fortunately, in that realm, it's not as much. Health insurance is totally out of control, in my humble opinion. And if you can't get on a group plan, if you're out there trying to buy individual insurance for you and your family, which most preachers do, it's really expensive, and you oftentimes end up with high deductibles. That kind of goes back to the previous one where we talked about the emergency fund and things of that nature. Some guys have gone this route. And I should say this 4 times, I'll just say it once. Do not go that route. Don't go that. Well, this stuff is really high. It is. I got high deductibles, and you do. A day in a hospital can be into 5 figures easily. Easily. A few hours in a hospital or a doctor's office or an emergency room can get into 5 figures, can get into 6 figures in basically no time at all. So what I encourage, do, make sure this is part of your budget. Make sure that you can afford and that you can pay for insurance for your family. The provisions are challenging because, again, normally you can't get in a group plan. Churches, I don't know what the percentage is. There are a few churches that have enough employees to where they'll get a group plan and they'll put the preacher and his family on that group plan. But most of the time, if you're working with a smaller congregation, you're probably going to be it as far as the employees go, or maybe one other, and there's not that plan. So when you go back into factoring, that's got to be an important line item. It's got to be, because if not, you're putting yourself at risk, you're putting your family at risk, you're putting your financial reputation at risk, you're putting the church's financial reputation at risk. And so people always ask this question, well, what's your solution? What's your solution to this health insurance thing? I don't have a great one. I really don't. I'll be glad to talk to you later. There's some, and I don't remember the exact terminology, there's some caring and sharing plans. Are any of you familiar with those? They are not they're not life insurance. They're not health insurance, but they work kind of sort of like it. I do not oppose them in any stretch of the imagination. I don't know all the specifics. I have an extremely good friend who is in that kind of plan. That plan may fit for you, but my encouragement is to very carefully study that in light of, in comparison to traditional insurance, and make sure your family gets covered. I keep hoping, wishing, praying that they're going to change some of this stuff, but it hasn't gotten any better. So make sure that you don't shortchange your family on health insurance. Number 7, plan for your retirement. No one else will. You may not believe this, but I can actually remember, at least bits and pieces, when I was as young as some of you guys. And I thought, my hair will never look this color, or it's got to be snowing. But time really goes on. And it really travels faster than you can imagine. I saw a survey, I think it was on the Jenkins Institute maybe a day or two ago, and they have a lot of good questions, and one of them was, what are your plans for retirement? Do you plan to never retire? Do you have a game plan? What is that? What is that? Well, for most of us, ultimately what we'd like to do is this. We'd like to preach forever and die in the pulpit, right? That is a little traumatic on the people in the congregation. But we'd really like to do that. My dad retired from his secular work, but he kept preaching, and he actually preached on the Sunday before he passed away on Friday. But that's kind of unique and not always the norm. I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I'm going to. There will be a peak in your value at some point in time. Because here's what you're going to hear on both ends of the spectrum. There are going to be times when you go and talk to congregations and say, we like you, but you're just a little too young. Just a little too young. We'd really like to have a guy that was a little bit older and had a little bit more experience. Or we wish you had some children, or we wish you were married, or da-da-da-da-da-da-da. On the other side, when you get hair the color of mine, they will say, you're just a little too old. We would really like to have a little bit younger guy with a lot of energy and maybe some kids to fit into the youth group. And you say, all right, too young, too old, somewhere in between. There is that point. There is that point where you will be just right. You will be the perfect prospect for any congregation. The problem with that is, it only lasts about a minute and a half. It'll happen at 2 o'clock one morning. You'll never know it. So you're either on the uphill slide or you're on the downhill slide. Either way there's always something. I say that not to be discouraging. There's plenty of places, plenty of opportunities for good guys that preach the gospel. But I'm saying this. There may be a time when you need to retire. You may need to retire because physically there are health issues. You no longer can do the work. There may be a reason that you need to retire because of mental issues. Unfortunately, that happens sometimes. There may be a need to retire because you are physically and mentally and emotionally worn out. You've given everything you had for a number of years. And guess what? Just like cars wear out, people wear out, right? They do. And so it's wise. It's wise to make a plan. Because if you don't make a plan, you have this option. You can go to the Church of Christ Preacher Retirement Fund and draw a pension, right? Does anybody know where that exists? If you do, I'd really like to have the contact info. It doesn't. Now, I realize some of our religious neighbors have those kinds of things. We don't have those kinds of things, in part because we're exactly what God told us to be. We're autonomous, and every congregation does their own thing. So, what I encourage you to do is start from day one planning for retirement. Now, you may never retire. You may preach your last sermon within the last week of your life. But if you don't, what have you lost by planning for retirement? You haven't lost anything. You're just better prepared to be a better financial steward in other ways. But if you do need to retire, you're the only one that's going to be able to significantly affect that. Again, I realize, and this is over 30 plus years preaching, growing up in a preacher's home, working with preachers for since the Old Testament almost. A lot of experience. A lot of experience. Oh, brother so-and-so, he's been a good one here for 15 years. He's been a good one here for 15 years, and we love him, but we need a younger guy, and we need some fresh blood, and so we've shared that with him. Nothing wrong with his preaching. He's doing really good, but we've shared that with him, and so we're going to part ways. Part ways on last Sunday of the month. Last Sunday of the month, they get up and they talk about how wonderful that preacher's been, how much he's blessed that church, how much it's grown. They have a potluck meal. The women bring the fried chicken and the casseroles. When it's all over, the meal's over, they say, brother so-and-so, come up here. We want to give you all a gift. They hand them a check maybe for $2,000. Wow, that's nice. Brother so-and-so's 60 years old. Brother so-and-so's going to live till he's 80 years old. How far do you think that $2,000 is going to go? It may not pay his health insurance that month. And so the point I'm trying to make, and a lot of times, I don't say a lot of times, there are times there's not even any check. There's just an attaboy, attagirl, we sure love y'all and appreciate y'all. Let us know anytime you need us. Oh, by the way, the other preacher's moving in next week. And so they love you while you're there, but then when you're gone, then somebody else. Same thing with housing. We'll talk about this more on the other side of that. But I'm a great advocate of owning your own home. I'm just a great advocate of that because, number one, you get equity in that home. Number two, and I've lived in preachers' houses before, so as I'm talking about that, the church builds a house for a preacher. I've always thought this was an interesting thing. So, what size house do they build? Small. Why? Cheaper. What if they build a big house? What if they're building a house? Who are they building the house for? They don't know. Maybe it's a single guy that doesn't need a lot of room. Maybe it's a guy that's building up the congregation with children. He has 7 kids. And so, anyway, it's just not, to me, the best thing. A lot of our congregations have gotten really smart about that. They've sold the houses, rented them out, or done something else and said, we're going to give you enough money. We're going to give you enough money to be able to purchase your own house. And if you want to live in a castle or if you want to live in a cardboard box, that's up to you. But we're going to make the provisions for that. But I've seen, sadly, too many preachers that when either their usefulness or their usefulness as perceived by the church was exhausted, nowhere to go. The church is not generally going to say, I've seen some cases where they've done this. I've seen some cases where churches were extremely generous and said, hey, you've been with us for 20 years. You've earned this house. You keep this house and we'll figure out something else. But most of them, they're not going to do that because of what? Where's the next preacher going to live? He's going to live in that same house. And what they're probably going to do is, you really need to be out by Friday because he's moving in on Saturday. And so making retirement plans, making preparations, it's big, it's huge. And I know for the younger guys in here, that's kind of a far away concept. Oh, that's a long way off. But it's really hard when you get to the sunset of your career to really start accumulating and making a lot of plans and investments in that realm. It's not finding the next Amazon that ultimately makes you money. It's time that makes you money. You can invest things at a relatively small interest rate or rate of return, and over a long period of time, compounding does amazing things. But it's really hard to catch up all at the end. And I know where the temptation is in this situation. You go to your first work. It's tight. You squeeze that budget, you squeeze that dollar till the eagle squalled. And you can make it. But you couldn't get anything in there for retirement. But you say this and you feel good about it. I tell you what, we'll get some raises and we'll do that. Or that next congregation we go to, we're going to get a little more money, we're going to do that. And you feel good about it and you preach the word. Well, sometime between then and whatever, another child comes along. Or something else happens. Or something else happens. And with the greatest of intentions, you say, okay, I still can't do that one. We got to have our health insurance. We got to keep God first. We got to do our savings. So, I'm going to get that. I'm going to get that at the next stop. And the next stop, and the next stop, and the next stop, and the next stop. and it never gets accomplished. And so I'm telling you some both mindset things this morning, and I'm telling you some behavioral things this morning. Most financial difficulties are not poor decisions per se in the foundational realm. It's bad behavior. And so keep in mind that if you don't plan for your retirement, no one else will. Again, we'll talk about it a little bit more in our next session, but I have found elders, men of the church, to be very willing, in a lot of cases, when you talk to them, to have the discussion we're having today. To say, hey, I know I'm only 25 years old, or I'm only 30 years old, or whatever, but, I think it's wise for me to plan for my retirement. Oh, by the way, did you work for a company where they help plan for your retirement? Yeah. Do you have? Yeah, I got a pension. Is that a really good thing for you? Yeah, that's a good thing for me. Well, would you help me? Would you help and assist us in getting something started so that one day we can enjoy that as well? And a light bulb goes on. They say, yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. And they'll be cooperative in helping doing some things in regard to retirement. Keys: make money, manage money. It really doesn't matter as much on number 1 as it does on number 2. People that manage money well can live on a lot less than people that make a lot of money sometimes. The mindset is, if I make more, I'm going to be better off. Seems logical. Pro athletes, I forget. I saw a survey. Pro athletes, after they leave their profession, it is amazing the percentage of people that within 3 years are flat broke. These are people that made millions, often hundreds of millions of dollars. And you say, how in the world could somebody make that much money and be broke? Their outgo exceeded their income. Their upkeep came their downfall. It wasn't so much of the making, it was the managing. I've seen and known other people, talked to one recently, that never made a lot of money, but they have gifted so generously to the church. The church is in their will, and it's almost the opposite. How in the world did this person become that good of a financial steward? And it goes back to manage. What really is important to me when I pull the card out or I get on the internet? Is this a need or is this a want? Boy, that gets into trouble, doesn't it? I don't embarrass anybody today. I'm just going to ask the question. I'm not going to ask the owner. But what's the latest iPhone number? 48 or 16 or?
11.
11. Okay, thank you. I'm not assuming you have an 11. You just know that. But there's nothing wrong with having an iPhone 11. But my flip phone sometimes works just as well. No, I really don't have a flip phone. But you would be surprised the distance, the close proximity of when I did have one. Nothing wrong with an iPhone 11. But if I can't do my iPhone 11, if I'm doing an iPhone 11 and I can't do my retirement plan, or I can't do my savings, or I can't do put God where He needs to be, I don't need an iPhone 11. There's nothing wrong with a new automobile. Nothing wrong whatsoever. But if I have to have a new automobile, but I can't do these other things, there's nothing wrong with nice clothing. But if my clothing bill exceeds my other stuff that I need, do you get the point? To get the point about where we have choices and opportunities and managing what we have. Nothing wrong with living in a $500,000 house. If you can do that and you can put God first and you can treat others well and you can do your retirement plan, you can do your savings and whatever. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like what we talked about before. We didn't bring anything in. We're not carrying anything out. Having food and raiment, let us therewith be content. The management. And you just have to keep managing. It's not something you can do and put in a drawer. It's not like buying a life insurance policy and stick it in the drawer and say, okay, when I die, somebody will get some money. management requires 24/7. It requires 365 because I have to stay on top of it. Have you ever noticed how people try to sell us stuff? You go in Walmart, Kmart, Costco, Sam's, whatever. They got thousands of stuff in there, don't they? I took a marketing class in college, liked it, enjoyed it. And one of the things that I was made aware of, I knew it, I just didn't know I knew it. But they, at the front of the store, they put all kind of little items there. Do you know what they call those items? Impulse items. You know why they call them impulse? Because you see that and go, whoo, I'd like to have that. And usually they're not expensive items. They don't put the $2,000 items at the front of the store. It may cost $1 or $5 or $10 or something like that. Doesn't mean a whole lot to an individual per se, but to them, and over time, if it's behavior, do I need it or I just want it? And I don't want you to leave here today saying, I can't ever have anything I just want and I don't need. But if it fits in the plan, that's cool. If it doesn't fit in the plan and the wants exceed what our needs and our plans are, it becomes counterproductive in that sense. So the managing of it, you don't have to be Dave Ramsey. You don't have to put your money in envelopes. If you want to do that and that's your best management system, great, fine, wonderful. Any plan, any financial plan that I've ever seen is better than no plan at all. I've never seen one where I go, you'd just be better off not to have a plan. But you don't have to have someone else's plan. It's a lot better to customize it to what you do. When I get a raise, and hopefully you guys will get a raise, that's a question. We'll talk about that in the other section. You say, boy, that other session is going to be full. We'll talk about it in the other session, but I want to know if I'm going somewhere, what's been the history of this church regarding raises for the preacher? The place I stayed at the longest, enjoyed a wonderful tenure at a place for 15 years. Every single year, those brethren gave me a raise. That wasn't $1 million, but they gave me a raise. And every single year, I profusely said, thank you. Thank you. Because, oh, by the way, if you don't get a raise, you get a cut in pay. You say, whoa, are they going to pay? No, they're not going to pay you any less, but there's this little thing called inflation. And inflation makes things cost more. And so you can't buy today, $100 today won't buy what it would buy 10 years ago or what it'll buy next year because of inflation. I've known of brethren, sadly, that have gone 10 or 15 years and never got a raise. And I wanted to ask the elders or the men, is this guy not doing a good job? Do you have expectations he's not meeting? What's the deal here? Do you guys in your jobs get raises? And so I'm getting off on a tangent here that I'm going to get back on the trail, but the point is, so how do I handle when I have more money? Again, I'm older. But if you told me, and I'm not a millionaire, billionaire, and I don't make $1 billion a year, but if you'd have told me when I was 25 years old that I would be earning what I currently earn today, I'd laughed in your face and I said, get off the hard cider. You can't drink dry with that stuff. But over time, you are able, but what can happen too, osmosis can kind of take place with that. That raise gets sucked up here, sucked up there, or whatever, and there's no real good plan for it. And so at the end of the year, you come back and say, hey, I made more money, but I don't have anything to show for it. One of the most popular statements before I sold my tax practice was when people, and I did both preachers and just general people, but people would come in, they would give me their stuff, and I'd fix it and give it back to them, and they'd say, there is no way. I said, no way what? There is no way I made that much money last year. And then we're looking at their W-2s, and I'm like, well, I can't say you did, and I can't say you didn't, but that's what so if I did, where did it go? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know where it went, but it went somewhere. And budgeting, planning, managing, those are huge things in regards to making sure you don't say that. So the solution is not necessarily to make more money. The solution is to manage what you make. People are broke at every financial level. People that make $10,000 a year are broke. People that make $100,000 a year are broke. People that make $1 million a year are broke. It's not about how much you make. It is how well you manage. Number 9, be able to distinguish needs from wants. We talked about that a little bit. And I'll give you an exercise, but I'll give you it with a warning. It will hurt your feelings. This exercise will hurt your feelings. So it's kind of like going to the dentist and they say slight prick. Their slight prick and my slight prick are not exactly the same. But get a sheet of paper and take what you spend. Take your checkbook or your bank statement or your mint or however you ultimately do it. And then just make 2 columns. Needs, wants. And then total it up at the bottom for a week, for a month, or whatever you want to do. Wow. And I'm not saying we can't have wants. I'm just saying we need to be able to distinguish them, because the wants are somewhat the overflow. The wants are after the pay God first, pay self second, good health insurance, good retirement plan. Oftentimes those needs get evicted for the wants. And so it's good to establish and to distinguish which ones are which, and make sure focus is in the right place. Number 10. I do not get a high grade in this, I'm telling you up front. Learn to be content with what you have. I am better than I used to be, but I'm not where I want to be. And I could say that probably about every area of my spiritual life and financial life and everything. But contentment. I don't have to have the 11. I don't have to have a new vehicle. Had lunch recently with a guy, and he was like, I was going to get me a car. Give me a new car. This guy does very well. He could have bought a new car and paid cash in all likelihood and never really knows the difference. But he said, I got to think about that. There's not anything wrong with the car I got. And I said, well, good for you. And he said, 13 years old, and I just went and had it painted, and I'm still driving. This guy could drive pretty much anything he wanted to. But in that particular scenario, he said, I am content with what I have. That's a spiritual lesson, not just a financial lesson. And it helps us in so many ways of life, more than just finances. I was laughing as we talked about that. I've got my fancy new truck out in the parking lot. It's a 2002 Ranger Edge. Some of you may not have been born in 2002. But anyway, and it does everything I want it to do. It gets me from point A to point B. The air conditioning works. The heater works. Oh, does the heater work? It's hard to get that thing turned down. The radio works, which is just a bonus. It's a pickup truck, so I can throw something in the back. Could I afford to buy a different truck? Sure. I like my truck. And I said all that to say this. When I pull up at our office in the parking lot, sometimes I'm parking between a Tesla, a Mercedes, and a BMW. And somebody goes, are you not intimidated? Do you not feel, lesser pulling your little Ranger? I'm like, I just really wish and I hope they have the same contentment with their vehicle that I have with mine. And I'm just really glad I probably don't have the payment they have with theirs. So it's a contentment thing. I don't have to have. I never want people to feel guilty about having nice things. There's nothing wrong with that. I never want people to feel guilty if they're successful financially. Some of the great heroes of the Bible. The father of the faithful was a very financially wealthy man. A man that God pointed out to Satan and said, hey, you want to see what I got? Check him out. He was a very well-off financial person. But he controlled his wealth. His wealth didn't control him. And so, contentment. If you want nice things and it fits and God's still first and others are still second, it's okay. It's fine. It's good. But don't let that come at the expense of those things at the top. Number 11. Know the difference between investments and expenses. Know the difference between investments and expenses. Investments could be defined this way. Something that the anticipation is will grow over a period of time. Notice I said anticipation. Not every investment turns out exactly that way. But that's the game plan, that 10 years from now, this is going to be more valuable than it is today. An expense is something that the value over time is going to decrease. And 10 years from now is not going to be worth as much as it is today. Let's do some examples here just really quickly. Happy Meal at McDonald's, is that an investment or an expense? Expense. Somebody may say, well, I'm investing in my body and I'm doing all this. Don't get that deep in the weeds. Just what's it going to be worth, 10 years from now, 2 days from now, that Happy Meal is probably going to be gone. And we're not going to talk about that either. An automobile, is that an investment or expense? Expense. Whoa. I may need that automobile. Why is it an expense? It's not going to gain value. You lose about 20% when you drive off the lot if you buy a new one. So 10 years from now, is that car or truck going to be worth more or less than what it is now? It's going to be worth less. So it's an expense. A house, an investment or an expense? Normally it's an investment. Now, that thing can flip on you, but normally that's an investment. And so hopefully 10 years from now, that house is going to be worth more than it is now. A savings account, an investment or an expense? Investment. Hopefully it's going to be worth more. A trip to the movies, an investment or an expense? Expense. Because, well, somebody said investment. As much as it costs now, it seems like an investment, but wow. Let me get off on one more tangent here. We've got 5 grandkids, and one of them's little. And so we carried the bigger ones, the ones that would sit still to the movies last Saturday, so Mom and Dad could go somewhere else. Whoa, have you been to the movies lately? That $100 bill, it won't even cover it. It won't cover it. And I'm like, hey, told my wife on the way home, I said, next time let's rent one of those $2 ones and get a $5 pizza, and we're a lot better off. But it was an experience with them and things of that nature. We couldn't afford to go to the movies every day or all the time. But I'm digressing. It's an expense. And the purpose of this thought process is to know the difference. What do I want to be putting more money into, investments or expenses? Investments, because that's what's going to gain value. Now, here's an interesting one. Your contribution to the church, is that an investment or an expense? It's an investment all day, every day, because God's going to multiply those seeds sown. So, knowing the difference, another good exercise. Pull your bank statement, pull your expense sheet down, and by every item, write investment or expense, and see how far out of whack that is, and see what you may need to change. Number 12, you did not take a vow of poverty. If you're a poor preacher, it ought not be because you chose that or someone suggested that. There's no reason whatsoever that the preacher needs to live at any financial level less than what other members live. You're probably not going to be the highest paid person in the congregation. You're probably not going to be the lowest paid person in the congregation. But I think we're getting away from it. I hope we're getting away from it. But sometimes there's this concept of, well, if I'm going to be a preacher, I've just got to make the ultimate sacrifice and I just can't ever have any money. That's not true. I don't read that anywhere in the Word of God. The only thing I read about preachers, as well as the rest of us, is that we need to be good stewards. Do not feel bad about asking or expecting reasonable wages. Workman's worthy of his hire. Again, if you go in and say, hey, I need a couple $100,000 a year, a Beamer, and a Tesla on the side, and I'd like 4 days off, and I really just like to do something a couple days a week, maybe one extra, probably not going to work. But if you do, let me know. I want to be the associate there. But there's no vow of poverty that you've taken with this. And so don't feel bad. Don't feel bad to say, Our family needs this to function in a financial way. Number 13, budgets help keep things under control. How many of you have a budget? Oh, this is a bad question. All right, basically half. How many of you stick to your budget? Less numbers, hands fly up. Pretty normal. But at least you have a target. I love basketball. I really do. But can you imagine a basketball game where there were no goals? We were just out there dribbling, going, whoo, shooting up in there about like my 7-year-old does sometimes. Wouldn't work. Wouldn't work. And the same thing's true. If we're just dribbling, shooting, passing, kicking without a goal, we don't know whether we're successful or not. And we're probably not going to be. You're probably not in this profession. How many of you are becoming preachers because of the money? You thought this is the way to be the most successful financially because of money. Good. I'm glad to see nobody's been deceived into that one. So, you're not doing this because of the money, but you need the money to live. All of us need money to live. And so, being good managers, help keep these things under control. So, that's your baker's dozen. Any questions that you've got, we're going to take a break in just a second, but any questions that you've got regarding the things we've talked about so far? He's not at a question, he's just stretching. He's saying, whoa, long time. All right, let's do this. It's 10:16 by that clock. Let's convene at 10:30, and then we will go over the other section. Oh. So far, so good. Most people stayed awake. I took that as a good sign. How are you?
Good, good.
Good.
Did you notice you had a typo on number 10?
No.
Because you say to live with the things that you want instead of the things that you have. Like be content with the things that you want and all. So.
Probably only a small minority of you will remember back to the television show that began Welcome Back. Does anybody remember the third word? Kotter. All right. So welcome back to the three most exciting hours of their life as they deal with finances and taxes. I know that sounds like a total contradiction, exciting and finances and taxes. Some of you asked some questions during the break. That was great. Feel free to ask other questions. Feel free to ask them out loud. I have some cards, some of my cards that just have my contact information up here in front of Zach, so feel free to get those if you think of questions later on. You can email me, you can text me, you can call me, you can write me, you can whatever you want to do in regards to that. I do not any longer prepare tax returns. Someone asked that before. I sold my practice in 2011. One of the smartest things I ever did was sign a covenant not to compete. So that way I could say, hey, sorry, I just can't do that anymore. But don't tell anybody, but the covenant's gone. But I basically have kids, self, and mom that I do taxes on now. So, but someone also asked, do you know somebody that's good that knows about ministers' taxes? And I've got the number and the name up here on the board. Charles is an elder of the church in Jasper, Alabama. He's a CPA. He is a Class A, awesome guy. I got permission to give you his number. He's usually busy as a one-armed paper hanger. You can reach out to him. He did give me a warning that he probably would not be able to do anything this tax season. But for those of you that are second-year students that will be going out, next year is the year, well, for 2020 is really the kind of critical year for you, and you might be able to get on his list. He can also help you with some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So how many second-year students are there here? Let me see your hands. All right. How many of you already have your place that you know that you're going to? How many of you are still looking? How many of you have signed your life away in some kind of contract to where you're going? Okay. All right. So I'm glad the rest of you have not, because that's going to become a part of what we're going to talk about this afternoon. Ministers and taxes, kind of like Jesus and Satan. So not really. If we didn't have taxes, we'd be in bad shape. Could our taxes be better used? Probably so. So that's all I'm going to say politically. All right. Who's a minister? We have a definition, and the IRS has a definition. And I want us to make sure that we completely understand what the IRS definition is so that you will know. There's a lot of different ways to preach. You can preach voluntarily, and you can just say, hey, I'm preaching, don't give me any money, I just want to preach. That's okay. You can be bivocational, and you can preach and do another job, and that's okay. You can preach for different congregations. I'm not that old, but I can remember hearing about the circuit riding preachers. It would just kind of go from place to place, place to place. I remember when my dad started preaching, he would go to one place on the first Sunday and another place on the second Sunday, and then it wasn't long, and he stayed at the same place every Sunday. But you got people that are preaching in that direction or in that system. Now, for the IRS purposes, here's what they say. Again, they didn't pull out the Bible to come up with this definition of minister, but for their 2,000-page code, here's what they say. A person who administers the sacraments. What in the world? How many of you have administered the sacraments? Normally what they're talking about there is maybe presiding, what we would say presiding over the Lord's Supper, or certain religious people do certain things, but that's one of their definitions. Conducts religious worship. You're kind of going, well, I'm not exactly in charge. There's a point where they let me talk for a few minutes, but I'm not exactly in charge. Has management responsibility. I don't know. I don't know about that one either. Ordained, licensed, or commissioned. How many ordained, licensed, or commissioned ministers are there in here? We're 0 for 4 so far, aren't we? All right. Considered a religious leader by his denomination. We're really kind of 0 for 5 because obviously the church is not a denomination. But it's the last one that I want you to kind of focus in on for IRS purposes. Preachers within a local congregation. And let me give you the definition that I'm going to use as a default one. There are others, and you can ask me, well, how does that play into this one? But The definition that I'm going to use just for our discussion today is you are the preacher. You are the only preacher for that. Well, you can have other ministers, but that is the only place that you preach other than gospel meetings or speaking, whatever. You are hired by that congregation to be their preacher or to be their associate or something like that. You work for a single congregation. That's the definition. As you can see, well, we really don't fall into some of the other ones. And you say, well, why does this even matter? Why does it matter if the IRS recognizes you as a minister or not? There's some differences. There's some distinguishing characteristics. There's some pros and there's some cons. And that's what I want us to talk about in this section. This is a little bit old, but it's still valid. Any attempt to confer ministerial credentials upon persons solely to qualify them for tax benefits without changing their duties or responsibilities in any way probably will not be recognized by the IRS or the courts. Okay, so what does that really mean? That means if somebody tries to get classified as a preacher just to get tax benefits, the IRS is going to say, So you say, well, what conditions could that be? I realize that there are a lot of congregations now, and I'm not speaking negatively about what I'm going to say, but they have different ministers. They have a minister of education or a minister of involvement or a minister of things. And again, I'm not throwing off on that, but I'm just saying, in general, I don't even say in general. It would be a case-by-case basis where the IRS would actually consider that person a minister or not for tax purposes. But what you guys are going to be doing, I'm assuming the majority of you are either going to be in the pulpit or may become associates or may become youth ministers, and you're doing that for one congregation. That's going to meet the criteria even though you're not ordained, licensed, or commissioned, or administer sacraments or those other things. And this point is simply to say, somebody trying to get to be that just to get tax breaks, it's not going to fly. All right, so the dual status of ministers. This is really important. They are considered self-employed for self-employment tax purposes. So, okay, I got that. Self-employed. Because a self-employed person doesn't have taxes withheld from their pay, and then they're responsible for paying their federal tax. If they have a state that has state tax, they have to pay it, but also they have to pay their self-employment tax or Social Security tax. Now, how many of you have worked for companies before where you were employees? Okay, so when you looked at your pay stub, W-2 or whatever, you had gross wages, net wages, and they were the same, right? No. Yeah. Federal tax that comes out. If you live in a state that got state tax that comes out. Then you got some that says Social Security, and then you got some that says Medicare. And they take those out. There may be some other things, insurance or whatever. But they take a certain amount out of your pay for Social Security and for Medicare. 6.2% for Social Security, 1.45% for Medicare, for a total of 7.65%. But not only do they take that out, that company also has to match that. And so basically for Social Security and Medicare purposes, 15.3% goes into the coffer in your account. Well, if you don't have an employer that's taking that out and matching it, then guess who gets to pay both sides of that? The self-employed person. So, and here's an example. So I decide I just want to go around knocking on people's doors and say, can I paint your house? They say, sure. What do you paint it for? Okay, I'll paint it for $500. I say, get at it. So I paint the house. How much money are they going to give me when I get through? $500, hopefully. And if they give me $500, why didn't they take any taxes out? Not their responsibility. They're not my employer. They contracted me to do that. I'm self-employed. Well, who's responsible for those taxes out of that $500? I am. And so we as preachers for self-employment tax purposes are considered self-employed. You're probably going, yuck. That means we got to pay both sides of that. That's true. But also, when we say dual, meaning two, we're considered employees for W-2 purposes. Employees. Well, if we're employees, why are they not taking and matching it? You'd have to ask somebody at a higher pay grade than me. But it's the dual status, and it's what we need to be able to understand. Ministers should, and before you raise your hand and say, church where I preach, or I know a bunch of places that don't, that happens. Ministers should, according to the tax code, get a W-2 form at the end of every year. Now, here's what ministers actually get. Some of them get W-2 forms like they should. Some of them get 1099 forms, which they shouldn't in most cases. Some of them get what? Nothing. They don't do anything because a lot of congregations are smaller. They said, hey, this is why we've done it for 100 years. We're not going to get stirred up with the IRS now, so we're just going to leave it like it is. And you say, well, we need to do this. And they say, well, we're not going to. Well, okay, so you basically got two choices. Take what they give you or don't give you or go somewhere else. But understand the dual status nature of it. All right, so best advantages, best tax advantages for preachers. That's what everybody wants to know. Number one is the housing allowance. The housing allowance, and we're going to go in detail on this in just a little bit. The housing allowance can save federal and state tax dollars. Number two, accountable reimbursement plan. And number three, a special retirement plan. So we'll talk about those specifically, but that would be my top three. Your housing allowance, accountable reimbursement plan, special retirement plan. Well, let's talk about how those work. So the first thing I want to do is I want to talk about a compensation agreement. I have zero problem with our word being our bond and everything ought to be good on a handshake. I don't have any problem with that. Here's what I do suggest in lieu of that in most cases. Sometimes people forget things, right? Sometimes elders change, things change, whatever. Sometimes over a period of time things may change or remembrance may not be good. It is always of an advantage to have a compensation agreement on paper, on purpose with your congregation. Whether you have elders or not, it's good to have that. That way somebody says, I thought I remembered we said this. I don't have to remember. Here it is. It's on paper. So what is that and sometimes people ask, well, should I have a work agreement with the congregation? I think that's a good thing. Should I have it on paper? That's good. You got stuff to go back to. Well, should they be in the same document? They can be. Don't have to be. I like the compensation agreement different. I like the compensation agreement to be one that is a standalone, but by no stretch of the imagination does it have to be. So here's what's going to be in our compensation agreement. We're going to have four things, or can have four things. It can be as simple as one thing. The church can say, we're going to pay you $52,000, we're going to give you $1,000 a week, and that's all we're doing. Is it okay if the church does that? Sure. Is that in your best interest to do that? Absolutely not. Why? What percent of that $52,000 are you going to pay tax on? All of it. What are you going to pay self-employment tax on? All of it. So if I can get that number down and still be able to get the same compensation legally and ethically and according to the IRS code, that's our game plan. So we're talking about four segments. We're talking about salary, accountable reimbursement cap, retirement designation, and housing designation. So here's how we would ultimately do that. You say, well, how am I going to break that down? So here's an example. We'll whack the $2,000 off, and we'll just say the church says, we're going to give you $50,000, and we don't care how you divvy it up. Just tell us and just do something that's not going to get us in trouble. So we've got a salary of $38,000. We've got an accountable reimbursement plan of $8,000. We've got a retirement designation of $4,000. So you say, how'd you come up with those numbers? We'll talk about that. How much does 38 and 8 and 4 add up to? 50, I hope. Somebody told me in the first session I had a typo. I said, whew, I've only got one typo in 13 slides. I am good. So $50,000. Well, why would we break it up this way? Well, let's talk about the elements, and I'm going to kind of go backwards rather than start at the first, because the salary is the last number I figure out. You say, why don't you figure it out last? I'll show you. So retirement designation. We talked about getting started early, getting a retirement plan set up. So let's say that we've talked with the church and they say, hey, we're willing to help you in this. We're willing to help you in this room. So let us know how we can help. And you say, okay, I want you each year to write a $4,000 check into the IRA of my choice. And say, okay, sure, fine, no problem. So they write a check to the IRA of your choice for $4,000. What's good? What two good things are about that? At least two.
They're paying something.
They're paying something, yeah. They're paying something. And you're getting that retirement plan going. And guess what? Is that $4,000 a year taxable? It's not taxable because they're sending it directly. It's kind of a glorified IRA in a sense. I mean, a glorified 401k in a sense. And so that's $4,000 I've got to pay less tax on. I don't have to pay federal, I don't have to pay state, and I don't have to pay that Social Security, that self-employment tax. The accountable reimbursement plan. Now, let me preface that by saying this. Are you going to have expenses in regard to your work as a minister that involve it? Absolutely. And most of the time the congregation wants to do this. They want to say, here's a lump sum, pay everything out of it, do everything out of it, we don't care. This is the max we can pay, we don't care what you do with it. So if you set up an accountable reimbursement plan, here's how it works. You need to do some calculation, and you're not going to be perfect on it the first time, and I'll explain kind of what my recommendation is in regard to how, if you go over or you go under. But you figure it up and you say, okay, we figure things like mileage, and we think things like supplies, or we figure things like travel and things of that nature, and we're going to guesstimate it's going to be $8,000 a year. So I don't know what that is. If you divide that by 12, it's less than $1,000 a month, obviously, but what you do then with that accountable reimbursement plan, and I should have brought, and if you want one, if you'll text me or email me or something, I can send it to you, but an example of an accountable reimbursement plan sheet. But what you do is you keep it filled out for the month, or you fill it out for a month. And as you have expenses, you keep your mileage log. If you go to the store and you need some supplies that are useful in your ministry, or if you buy some computer software anyway, everything that you use that's ministry related, you keep that in a log. And then at the end of the month, you give that to your treasurer. Oh, by the way, your treasurer needs to be your next best bud, because he's the person that can make your life really good in this arena, or he can make your life really bad in this arena if he says, I don't want to do anything extra, I just want to do what I've always done. So first thing you do when you get the congregation is get in good with the elders. The second thing is take the treasurer out to lunch. So what you're doing here is you're going to give him a form or a sheet. And let's just say month one has $720 worth of expenses on there. He's going to write you a check for $720. Now, the good part about that is when he writes you that check for $720, it's a reimbursement for an expense. It's not salary. So guess how much federal tax you pay on that? Guess how much state tax? Social Security and Medicare? 0. That is my favorite tax rate, is 0. And it hadn't changed in 40 years. I don't even have a close second. So you set up the accountable reimbursement plan and you report to them each month. They write you a check. The question always comes up, why can't they just divide it by 12 and give me the same check every month? The reason they can't divide it by 12 and give you the same check every month is because you don't know what your expenses are going to be, and when you do it that way, you're not being reimbursed dollar for dollar, and it disqualifies it, and all that money goes back into taxes, and you defeated everything you just tried to do. So it has to be a dollar for dollar. So someone says, well, okay, we're guessing at this, right? We're guessing at it. Okay, so what happens if we get toward the end of the year and we've gone over the 8,000? Number one, don't go over the 8,000. But let's say you get to December, and you get to December and you're at $7,800, and you have $500 worth of expenses, and you say $7,800, $8,500, they don't match. What you do is you turn in $200 worth in December, and you hold the other $300 till January, because you can hold your expenses, or you can have them reimbursed up to 60 days after they've incurred. You haven't gone over your $8,000. You've got that to go on your next one. You're probably going to adjust your agreement the next year by that amount or some semblance of it. And so we've still maintained our integrity with our accountable reimbursement plan. So the other question is, okay, so we over budget or over guesstimated it. So I get to the end of the year and we've only spent $7,500. Well, we had $8,000 budgeted. How do we deal with that? Let me say this real clearly and plainly. I don't want you to misunderstand. They cannot guarantee the $8,000 by guaranteeing that you're going to get it whether you spend it or not. If they do, it violates that agreement and it violates the law. But can a church give a bonus at the end of the year if they want to? Sure. I hope you make sure they know that. Sure, they can give you anything they want to. Is a bonus taxable? Yes. Do you want the bonus even though it's taxable? Yes. Until the tax rate becomes 100%, you are better off getting something taxable than you are saying, no, if I'm going to pay tax on it, I don't. So they budgeted $8,000. They only spent $7,500. Is there anything wrong with them saying, we think we want to give you a $500 bonus? Nothing wrong with that. The places that I worked were more than happy to understand that and say, hey, if you don't spend that, we're going to consider giving you that as a bonus. Consider is a big word. They didn't say guarantee, we're going to consider. Every single time they considered it, guess what they did? They gave it to me. Did they violate the law? No. Did I violate the law? No. They reimbursed, and then they chose a bonus. Simultaneously, the bonus was that amount. Sometimes they would add more to the bonus, but that way you're still going to get ultimately your money. Doesn't matter to them. And so that's the way to do it. Where did the 38 come from? It was my backup number. You say, what do you mean? It's what we backed up into after we took out the accountable reimbursement plan and after we took out the retirement designation. So that's kind of where we did. Now, I held this one off for the last because I would have, how many good math people do I have in here? Okay, very few. Y'all are preaching versus math. All right. So just remember, many are called and few are chosen. So, but the 12,000 is a part of the 50,000. So if I showed all four of them to you, you'd have gone, wait. 38 plus 8 is 46, and 4 is 50, and 12 is 62. Whoa, we're only working with 50. With the housing allowance, it's considered as a part of the salary. So what you do is you designate a housing allowance, and we'll talk about that in a second, about what all that's involved in that. If you go over the housing allowance, it doesn't matter. If you go under the housing allowance, whatever the difference is, you have to add back to your salary for W-2 purposes. And so the housing allowance helps us to be able, again, to reduce some taxes. Now, with a housing allowance, you don't pay federal, you don't pay state tax, but you do have to pay self-employment tax. So here's our computation. Here's our math. So you got 38 of salary, less 12 of housing allowance, and your net for your W-2 is $26,000. Now, I didn't see a lot of math hands go up, but I think you can get this one. If you have a choice of paying tax, what was our original amount? 50,000. Boy, I got some folks paying good attention. So 50,000. You got a choice of paying tax on 50,000 or 26,000. Which one are you gonna pick? 26. All right. So y'all better math than you said you were. So you're gonna pay on 26. Now, did the church give you any more or any less money to arrive at that? No, they're paying exactly the same thing. It's just the way it's divvied up. It's just the way. Basically, it costs it motivates the treasurer to pay one extra check a month, and you make it so easy because you put in his box a sheet and you circle the number at the bottom. That's it. So by simply putting in a housing allowance, putting in an accountable reimbursement plan, putting in a retirement plan, well, the treasurer would have to make the payment for the retirement plan too. What you have done is you have taken your 50,000 and cut it almost into half just by having a compensation agreement. So let's talk about the housing allowance for a moment. What all is covered in the housing allowance? How do you determine that? What's the maximum amount that you can do? Your housing allowance can cover pretty much anything that is necessary for the maintenance of a facility, the maintenance of a house. That would include your payment, that includes your principal and your interest, that would include your insurance, that would include your property tax, that would include your utilities, that would include the cost to keep up the lawn, lawnmowers, gas, things of that nature. That would include furniture. That would include cleaning of the furniture if you did that. So those are pretty much the contents of the housing allowance. I want to pause. I know that doesn't give you a detail, but what questions do you have maybe about certain things that could or couldn't be a part of the housing allowance? Yes, sir.
The payment is not.
The payment is included, yes. Yes, it can be included as a part of the housing allowance. So it's one of the few times when you're better off to owe rather than to have a fully paid off house. Food is not. Clothing is not. Appliances are. And again, I wish I'd have brought that sheet, but I can give you kind of a list of that. So what's the maximum, and that's what's on our screen, what's the maximum housing allowance that you can designate? Because some years ago, you can thank some of, not necessarily our brethren, but some televangelists that were living kind of high on the hog and these multi-million-dollar mansions and claiming all these extravagant housing allowances. So the IRS didn't like the fact they were losing some of their money. So they came in and said, okay, we're going to make some changes here and we're going to max this thing out. The maximum is the fair rental value of the house furnished plus utilities. The first time I read that, my question was, what in the world is a fair rental value of the house furnished plus utilities? The IRS till yet has explained or identified what that is. So what you have to do basically is take a guesstimate there. Some have suggested you can use the fair rental value as what would your house rent for if you rented it out. Or some have suggested 1% of the fair market value. To my knowledge, neither of those have been tested in court. I do think both of them are good metrics, and I'll kind of give you an example. So if the house that you're living in, either the parsonage that the church provided or your own, let's just say that it would rent for $1,000 a month. And let's say that the utilities average $400 a month. So the max housing allowance that you could use in that case would be $1,400. And again, the furnished with what? Furnished with cardboard boxes, furnished with antiques from China. You know, it's pretty broad out there the way they leave that. Or the actual housing expenses themselves. So let me change the first example. Let's just say your house would rent for $1,600 a month. And let's say the utilities are $400 a month. That's $2,000 a month. So your max housing allowance in that case would be $24,000. So you could take up to $24,000 or your actual expenses, whichever is less. So if the max is $24,000 based on fair rental value and utilities, but your payment, expenses, whatever, only total $14,000, you could only use the $14,000, the lesser of the two. And so that's their latest, greatest computation in regard to that. Questions about the housing allowance or the housing allowance maximum? Yes, sir.
If you were going to take fair rental value to mean if you rented your house out,
Mm-hmm.
would that be per year, right?
You could do it per year, per month. You got to come up with some kind of annual housing allowance.
Okay.
The easiest way to calculate to me is just do it by the month. If my house rented for $1,600 a month and the utilities average $400 a month, that'd be $2,000 a month, and 2,000 times 12 is 24. So what you establish is a maximum housing allowance, and then and you may not necessarily want to use that. Your calculation may be, I'm not even going to come close to that. I'm just going to do $15,000. Now, the dangers, the good, the bad, and the ugly. If you designate $15,000 and you spend $16,000, you lose the $1,000. If you designate $15,000 and you only spend $12,000, then you have to add $3,000 back into your salary as unreimbursed housing allowance. You would rather kind of sort of be under than over, because if you go over, you lose it. Now, the benefit of the housing allowance is this: you don't pay federal or state tax. you still have to pay self-employment tax on that. So, other questions as I've kind of muddied the water up about the housing allowance? Yes, sir.
Utilities, does it include, internet, or just, what does utilities include?
That's a good question, and I've not seen anything definitive on that. I think obviously you're safe with electricity, obviously you're safe with water, obviously you're safe with sewer. I don't have an issue personally, I'm not the auditor, I don't have an issue personally with internet. That's considered a utility. The cell phone really kind of threw a monkey wrench into it, because before a phone was kind of considered a utility associated with a house. Some of you may not ever remember this, but maybe you can talk to your parents or grandparents. We used to have these things in our houses that had lines run to them, and you picked up and you kind of dial there. You may not have seen it, but it was more of a housing thing. I've never seen an audit on the cell phone. I don't include the cell phone on it just simply from the fact it's not really a part of the house. So could it fly? It might. I don't know. But I don't use the cell phone. The internet, if you're using it for your computer inside the house, things of that nature, I wouldn't have a problem with it. If you got 10 auditors auditing it, they might give you 10 different answers. But the government is really good about passing laws and then not necessarily defining everything that's in there. So my normal response is use common sense. Not that that would help you a whole lot when you're dealing with auditors, but use common sense. And I hope none of those are listening on the live stream. But use common sense, and that generally works out pretty good. If you pay extra payments on your house, extra principal, that can count as well. So, any other questions, comments on the housing allowance? Yes, sir.
So if you're under your housing allowance,
Mm-hmm.
You can make principal payments to get up to your housing allowance.
Sure, that'd be a great strategy. Yeah, let's just say your housing allowance is $15,000, and let's say in December you calculate and you've only spent $13,000, and you write a check December 31st for $2,000. You've paid down on your principal and you've saved yourself the taxes on $2,000. So that's a good strategy. That's a good strategy. Now, if you can have $2,000 extra after Christmas, I want you to tell me what your budget looks like, because I need to talk to you. But anyway, it is a good strategy. So yeah, or if you see during the year. Now, let me contrast a couple things on housing allowance and accountable reimbursement plan. Accountable reimbursement plan, you need to give that treasurer, that whoever, you need to give them an accounting for that every month. That's what they're going to write your check for. Your housing allowance, you don't have to give them anything. All basically that you need is in your agreement, you need to have that agreement that states that the housing allowance is set for X amount. That's all you have to have. You don't have to give any documentation. It's your responsibility if you didn't do the maximum to add the other back. Does that make sense? I'm getting some fuzzy. I don't know if it's lunchtime and we're food, donut glaze or whatever. So feel free to ask. There's no dumb questions in this. So, but the housing allowance is one of the, to me, best advantages that you have out there. 2 ways to pay taxes. So, okay, so how do I pay? Let me back up from that just a second. And again, I didn't bring them. I probably should have. But I've got a sample compensation agreement. I got a sample housing allowance. I got a sample accountable reimbursement plan form, and I'll be happy to send those to you. And one of the things that I always do on mine personally, and again, I'm in it with you guys. I do the same thing you guys do. I have my agreement, my accountable reimbursement plan, my housing allowance, the whole 9 yards. So I'm right there with you. One of the things I do on my compensation plan is a compensation agreement. I put these stipulations will remain in effect for future years unless modified by both parties in writing. Why would you want to say that? The reason I want to say that is hopefully we're going to have a new one every year. We're going to have a new compensation agreement. But if somehow we forget or we don't get it done until February or March or April or something crazy happens, the housing allowance has to be designated in advance. So if you were going to set up a housing allowance right now, this is almost the end of February, you couldn't do anything from January 1 till you got the housing allowance signed. So if you put that little phrase in there, these stipulations remain in effect going forward unless modified in writing. I've perpetually set that housing allowance in effect. Well, once we do a new housing, or once we do a new agreement every year, okay, it's been modified by both parties in writing. But that just, in case something slips, doesn't get done, whatever, you got yourself covered for that point in time. So, 2 ways to pay taxes. Have the church withhold and send in taxes. Remember, you should be getting a W-2 from the church. If you don't get a W-2 from the church, it doesn't mean you can't go to heaven. But you need to get one if they're willing to do that. So, on that W-2, it looks a little different because under Social Security wages, it has 0. Under Medicare wages, it has 0. Remember, you're responsible for that 15%. So, you can have them withhold federal tax, you can have them withhold state tax. You cannot have them withhold Social Security and Medicare tax. And you go, yuck, then I'm going to have a big bill at the end of the year. But here's what you can do, and here's where having a good tax preparer that knows preachers' taxes is important. So, let's just say that my federal tax was going to be $12,000 a year. Okay, so I tell the church, hey, how about holding $1,000 out per month for my federal tax? And let's just say I knew that my self-employment tax was going to be $6,000 a year, and I thought, I don't want that big burden at the end of the year. What you can do is you can go to the treasurer or whoever's handling it and say, hey, forget that $1,000, take $1,500 out. Take $500 extra federal tax out because I got to do $6,000 self-employment tax. It doesn't go in the Social Security, it doesn't go in the Medicare, but it goes in the federal tax. You say, is that not going to mess things up? No. What happens is when you get to the tax return, you have federal tax plus self-employment tax, and you got total tax right here, and then whatever you've paid in on your federal goes toward the total tax itself. So what I've always done, I've always had them take extra federal tax out for me to be able to cover my self-employment tax. Does that make sense? Because at the end of the year, how many people want to pay taxes when you do your 1040? None? How many are just happy breaking even? How many would like to get a refund back? How many would like to pay nothing in, then get a refund back? That's what most of our society's like. It doesn't work that way. So the more you pay, the better off you're going to be. So that is one way of doing it. Now, as you sit down and talk with them, and you probably have already gotten ahead of me here, as you sit down and talk with them before you even make an agreement, these are some of the things you want to talk about. Some of the things you want to talk about. Don't make demands, but do you withhold taxes for your preacher? Do you give him a W-2? Would you be willing to do that? It's kind of a backdoor way sometimes of finding out how workable churches and elders and, I couldn't tell you how many elders, treasurers and all that I've talked to over the years. I've served as an elder, so I kind of know that side too. But a lot of them are willing to say, hey, we will do anything we can to help you if you'll show us how or help us to do that, if it'll help save you money, and we're doing this legally, and we're doing this morally, and we're doing this ethically. Some of them will say, I don't understand it. We ain't done it like this before. It's been fine for 40 years, and we're keeping it the same way. Well, there's nothing, I don't say necessarily wrong with that. They do need to comply. But what that may tell me is, and this is non-tax related, if we come up with new ideas or new plans or ways to grow or other things that we want to work with, totally non-tax related but church related, guess what their response to that may be? I don't understand it. We ain't never done it that way. For 40 years we've done this and we're just fine with it. It's not a litmus test. Doesn't have to be a litmus test, but it may give you some insight on how workable these people are with things that are different. Always done it this way before is a church killer. It really is. I'm not going to get on my tradition tangent today. There's some traditions that are really good, really helpful, really beneficial. sometimes we struggle in the church because we don't do a good job distinguishing truth and tradition, and we let traditions hold us back from doing a more effective way of sharing truth. End of tangent. So, that's one way. Have the church withhold and send in taxes. The other way is send in taxes quarterly to the IRS in the appropriate state. How many of you plan to preach in Tennessee or have an idea of preaching in Tennessee? Okay, that's good. Tennessee is a state that, I don't want to say doesn't have an income tax, but its income tax is different. Every state has its own either state income tax or some other variation. So you may not necessarily be in a state that pays income tax. But if your state does, then you should be making quarterly estimates. So we figure out, okay, we tag everything, we add everything, and I'm going to owe $12,000 in federal and unemployment taxes, or not unemployment, state, we hope we're not unemployed. That's Social Security and Medicare. So I'm going to owe $12,000 for the year. So, you good mathematicians, how much is that a quarter? $3,000. So, they'll provide you little coupons, and you'll need to send a check for $3,000 each quarter. Here's a danger point. I want to mention this. The danger point is this. If you don't have a plan, probably the last quarter or the last week of the quarter, they're probably not writing you a $3,000 check. Your salary may not be that. So if you haven't set that money back, where are you going to get it? Good question. And then here's what can happen. Sadly, I've seen it too many times. Well, I don't have the money this quarter, but I'm going to double up next quarter. Next quarter is the quarter that the washing machine and the dryer and the transmission all go out. So and then I get to the end of the year, and guess what I've got set back? Nothing. And now what kind of tax bill have I got? $12,000. Where am I going to pay that from? I don't know. So if the church says, we don't want to withhold, we're just a small church and we don't really want to get into all that, it's really important that you set aside, if you get paid weekly or if you get paid monthly or twice a month or whatever, that you set that aside. I'd encourage you to set up maybe even a special savings account for that. And you touch it under what circumstances? None. Zero. If a Martian abducts one of your children, I'd say that would be an exception. But other than that, we're going to leave that totally alone. And so it's important to be self-disciplined in that area. Now, some churches will do this. Some will say, we don't want to get into all that W-2 and withhold and all that stuff, but if your quarterly payment is $3,000, we'll just hold that out and we'll write you one check at the end of the quarter for $3,000. You can put it in your bank and turn around and write it to the IRS. Is that a good thing? Sure. You don't have to do the discipline part there. They're already doing that for you. Now, you're going to get less each month or each quarter or each week, depending on what your setup was. But that's kind of the two ways to do that. Questions about how do you pay? Clear as mud, right? Exemption from self-employment tax. How many of you have heard at least that preachers can become exempt from paying self-employment tax? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. All right. There is an option. And I want you to listen carefully because I don't, one, want to misrepresent this. Two, I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm about to say. There is a choice. You can apply to exempt from self-employment tax, Social Security, Medicare. And you say, hey, that sounds really good to me. That sounds like a no-brainer. That's 15% that I could not have to pay. And you multiply 15% over my salary over 40 years. Whoo, that sounds like a no-brainer. But the choice does not come just yes or no. And what I have up on the board or up on the screen is this is from the IRS. This is straight from. This is a quote from their form to apply for exemption from self-employment tax. And I want to read it and I'll comment on 2 or 3 things. I certify that I am conscientiously opposed to, or because of my religious principles, I am opposed to the acceptance, quotation, for services I perform as a minister, end of parentheses, of any public service that makes payments in the event of death, disability, old age, or retirement, or that makes payments for medical care. Before I comment, let me say this. I have dear friends, dear friends, that are in self-employment. I have dear friends that have exempted from self-employment. So I'm not casting aspersions in any direction here. But what I do want you to understand, because you're at the choice-making point, and you have to do this, you have to make the election within 2 years of becoming ordained, licensed, or commissioned. See any issues there? What would the issue there be? We're not ordained, licensed, or commissioned. So when does that clock start ticking for preachers in the Church of Christ? They haven't defined that. The normal definition, logical definition, would be within 2 years of the time you began your first real preaching job, or when you get out of the school, when you become recognized. So there's a 2-year window. After that, it doesn't matter. You can't go back and redo that. So you've got a 2-year window. But make sure, whatever you decide here, you understand what this is saying. It's not saying, I want to pay less tax. All of us want to do that. It's not saying, I believe I could be a better steward by taking that 15% and investing it and getting something that would provide more money for me. You could probably do that. That's not what this form is saying. And I've had preachers that have told me that they signed and exempted years and years and years ago because somebody told them they could be a better steward by not paying self-employment tax. That's probably true, but that's not what the form says. I've had preachers say, I called the IRS, and somebody at the IRS said, are you opposed to abortion on demand? And I said, yes. And they said, well, you qualify to exempt. Doesn't say anything about that here. That's not what it says. It says that I am certifying, I am conscientiously opposed, or because of my religious principles. So we'll stop there. I have opposition in conscience. We know it's important to have a clean conscience, don't we? And if we have an opportunity to do something or not do something because it violates or doesn't violate our conscience, we certainly need to keep a conscience as clean as possible. Or because of my religious principles. In our case, that's book, chapter, and verse. So I'm saying that I've either got book, chapter, and verse, or I've got a real conscience issue with. Now let's see what it is. It's to the acceptance. The acceptance. I want to hone in on that. The acceptance of public insurance that makes payment in the event of death, disability, old age, or retirement, or that makes payments for medical care. Now let me define those terms. Acceptance of public insurance. What do most people start receiving at age 62 or 65 or somewhere along in there? Social Security. That is public insurance. So this says I've got Bible for, or I've got a conscious opposition to receiving that money. I hadn't met anyone yet that has Bible for that or a conscientious opposition to the receiving of that money. There may be folks, my framework is small. But you've got to have one or the other. You've either got to have a religious principle that violates or a conscience principle that it violates to receiving this money. This is not about paying in this money. This is not about stewardship. This is about receiving these payments. Death, disability, old age, or retirement. Social Security is the main one. Guess what most people's health insurance is beginning at age 65? Medicare. Guess what Medicare is? Public insurance. So what I'm saying is because of my Bible or because of my conscience, I couldn't accept Medicare. I couldn't accept Social Security. I'm opposed to those because of convictions that I have religiously. Now, if a person has those convictions, by all means, they ought to sign. They ought to certify. They ought to exempt out. But I think it puts folks in some real quandaries. And I'll go back to the parentheses, it says, for services I perform as a minister. So that is just in that realm. So let's suppose, and I talked to some of you in the break, let's suppose some of us are bivocational and we don't have a choice. We pay into the system. We pay into the system if we work for whoever we work for that's non-church related. So we pay into the system. All right. It comes Social Security time. Are we going to accept that Social Security? If so, am I going to accept it in violation of my conscience? In violation of my religious principles? How can I accept Social Security here and Medicare here, but I oppose it on that form so I didn't have to pay it in? Or your wife, she paid into the system. Are you going to say, honey, look, we're opposed. We're opposed to receiving public insurance. We're opposed to receiving Social Security and Medicare, so we can't accept this. Back up to my earlier statement. I am not telling you what to do or what not to do. I'm telling you, if you consider exempting, make sure you can do it with a clean conscience. Make sure you can do it with the understanding of what this says. And if you exempt, I'm not going to be your judge. I'm not going to, if you fall into that category, that's when you and God and the IRS. What I did find quite a bit when I especially first got into my side of the ministry and the taxes, people that were exempt, I just casually asked, what part of this, why, whatever, and people will say, I don't know, they just told me to. Some people at the school told me to, or preaching school, or not necessarily this one, but they just told me I needed to do that. And I'm like, have you read this? And I would let them read it, and they said, I hadn't read that. Do you fall in that category? I don't fall in that category. What can I do now? And guess what the answer is? Nothing. There was one window opened up in the 25 years that I had a tax practice that would let you opt back in, no questions asked. You could opt back in, start paying then, and say, and I had some folks that did that, said, hey, I was misguided, I was misled when I did this, I opted back in. So, will there ever be another one? I don't have a clue. I don't know what the IRS will do. I would imagine with all the trouble Social Security's in, I would think they'd be posting that all day long. Hey, if you want back in, we'll take your money. But they're not doing that. And so just understand the concept there. And, so now the folks that are exempt are kind of like, yuck. I didn't understand that. And oh, by the way, when I get 62, if they hadn't worked anywhere else, or 65, guess what Social Security they're going to receive? None. What about Medicare? None, in all likelihood, unless they change the laws. You think buying insurance is bad now? Try buying it at 65. And so I say this in every presentation I make, not to tell you what's right, not to tell you what's wrong, not to tell you what to do, not to tell you what not to do. Just be sure you understand what the form says. And here's the second part. You also have to certify that you've informed your church, we would say congregation, that we are conscientiously opposed to, or because of religious principles, we're opposed to accepting those things. So if I'm understanding that correctly, I've got to go to my elders or the men or whatever and say, folks, by law, I've got to tell you that I'm opposed to people receiving public insurance, Social Security, and Medicare. And there's some other things involved, but those are the main two. That may create some problems as well, because guess what? Probably 90% of the people out in the audience are going to be doing? Receiving Social Security and Medicare, if not now, at some point in time later. So my whole message and my whole point on this is know what you're doing. Understand what you're doing. At that point, my conscience is clear, my conscience is clean, because that's you and God and the government in regards to that. But you guys, most, if not all of you, are still at a point where you're going to have shortly a 2-year window to do this. And I would not feel right just ignoring this subject. I feel like you need to know what the law says. And I've had people, again, I'm talking about people I dearly love. I'm talking about extremely smart people that have said, well, That's your, not necessarily to me, but that's your interpretation. I interpret it differently, and I feel like it's the best thing for me to do. I won't argue with that. I'm just telling you what I see at face value and my understanding of it. Any questions in regard to exempting from Social Security? Yes, sir.
If you file separately from your spouse,
Mhm.
say you're married and she still pays into it,
Mhm.
you know, can you legally do that? Can you file separately? She can still have a secular job, pays into it, and she receives Medicare eventually, but you say, I don't want that.
Sure. And you don't even have to file separately. You can still file a joint return. This is just going to affect your taxes per se. She could still receive it, and you could not receive it, so you don't have to file a separate return to do that. So, and, you know, again, that certainly is a possibility. All right. Important attributes to paying minimum taxes. Set up a compensation agreement in advance. I highly encourage, get that done before you shake hands with the elders or men of that congregation to become their preacher. It's not a litmus test, but you do find out the workability. Again, so many of our brethren are so good. What they didn't know, they're still willing to do if it's okay. Like I said, I couldn't tell you how many conversations I've had with elders or treasurers or men, and they say, we don't know anything about this. Is this okay? And when we got through with our conversation, their response was something similar to this. Hey, great. We're glad to learn it, glad to do it. Anything we can do to legally and morally and ethically help our guy, we want to do. I've seen other cases where they said, we're just not comfortable with it. Now, you say, okay, so from your vantage point, how does that affect you? Well, you can go do the math or get your tax preparer to do the math, and you can see what it costs you, the difference. And I have zero problem with you getting with the elders of the men and saying this, guys, you know, in trying to be the best steward possible, you know, I've presented a compensation arrangement that will help me render to Caesar what's Caesar's, but to pay the least amount, you know, legally possible. You've chosen that you don't want to do that, so it's going to cost me an extra $4,000 a year in taxes. I'd like for you to consider giving me a $4,000 a year raise to pay for my taxes. I have no issues with, because whose pocket's going to come out of it if you don't? It won't come out of yours. Or really, it'd be more than $4,000, because then you got to pay taxes on that $4,000. I'd factor that in and say, I'm going to have to pay $5,000 more in taxes without doing this. So would you consider doing that? And then you got to decide, am I going to eat it, or, you know, and they might say, hey, you know, we didn't necessarily want to do this, but we'll give you more money if that's going to keep you at the same spot. Again, it kind of helps you understand workability. The best of the best of the best relationships that you can have as a preacher is with good and godly elders, or men of the congregation if you don't have elders. I don't want to say the worst of the worst of the worst, but there's nothing else really close if you can't have a good relationship, a good working relationship. And when I've moved or changed congregations or things of that nature, this segment factored into that. How well am I going to be able to work with these guys? How well are they going to be able to work with me? So, you know, that can be something to at least give some consideration to. Good record keeping. Good record keeping. So, the accountable reimbursement plan is founded upon good record keeping. Get receipts. Keep receipts. Involve your spouse if that's one of her strengths, if that's one of the areas that she has an interest in, because you only get reimbursed for what you keep up with. Mileage. I hadn't even looked at 2021. I think the mileage is somewhere around 54 cents per mile. And we didn't go into, is it better to use actual expenses or mileage? 99 times out of 100, it's better to use mileage. But, excuse me, keep up with where you go. When you go to the hospital, keep it on your day planner or on your phone or whatever you do. But keep up with that. It's out in my truck. I keep a little handheld recorder. I know it's on my phone, but flip phones, no, we're not going there. But anyway, there's a place on the phone I'm sure I can dictate into, but I know how to use that little recorder. So Memphis School of Preaching, 22120, 177 miles one way. So that way I'm not going to forget where I went. I'm not going to forget the mileage. I'm not going to forget those things. And so I use that for a ton of things. I don't know about you, but my best sermons come when I'm mowing grass. I don't know where you're going to write anything down mowing grass. If you try that, you're probably going to end up with a mower in the house. But don't try to ride it and mow. Or I'm riding down the road. And so going back this afternoon, I'll dictate probably quite a bit in that little recorder about things that happened here or something I suddenly remembered I need to talk to this person, that person. That's all free from just the advantages beyond that. But keep up. Be a good record keeper. Number 3, get a tax preparer who is familiar with taxes for ministers. There's a lot of really good CPAs, tax preparers, that don't really know much about ministers' taxes. And what they'll do is they'll take the safe route. They won't do you wrong from the standpoint of they won't do anything that's illegal, but they won't necessarily, if you start talking about accountable reimbursement plan, housing allowance, things of that nature, they'll kind of go, I don't know about that stuff. So find someone. I've given you Charles' number. I doubt, you might can sweet talk him into this year. I doubt it. He said he was pretty filled. But especially if you're going to go and get a compensation agreement, a lot of you second-year students will be doing that soon. He can help you with that. You might get set up for next year. He can help you with getting estimates and things of that nature. So that to me is huge, is getting somebody that's familiar with ministers' taxes. All right, questions? Yes, sir.
As far as keeping your good records and keeping all the receipts, I've seen my dad have files filled with receipts. Is it okay in the newer digital age to just use your printout from your bank?
Sure.
So that way you don't have to keep hundreds of receipts from everything that you purchase.
Sure. Just have something that has a backup to it where you can get to that if you need to. But
A
yeah.
lot of places now, when you swipe your card, they'll email you a receipt instead
Sure.
of giving you a paper one.
Yeah.
But all that still works.
Short answer, digital receipt is just as good as a paper receipt. That's hard words to come out of my mouth because I'm an old schooler, but and I'm in cahoots with the tree companies. But digital does work fine. Yes, sir.
Does apartment rental fall underneath housing allowance?
It would. And I'm glad you said that because I want to mention a couple things there. So housing allowance, what about if I'm in a parsonage or a church-provided house? You can, and the first answer to your question is yes. A rental is just like mortgage payment. But if you're in a house provided by the church, then they may pay everything. They may say, hey, you just live there and whatever. If they pay everything, then you have to pay self-employment tax on the fair rental value of that house plus whatever utilities they pay for. They may say, we're going to give you the house, but you're responsible for the utilities and whatever. So in that case, it's still good to have a housing allowance. You may need to buy lawnmower stuff or things of that nature. Yes, sir.
The church that I'm going to work with, currently their plan is to put me up in the church building itself,
Mm-hmm.
in one of the rooms there.
Mm-hmm.
How would that work with the fair rental value and all that?
I've been doing this a long, long time, and I've never known anybody put the preacher up and join hard to the synagogue. But anyway, if I had a prize, you'd get it. I've never had that question. Is that a permanent arrangement, or is that just a...
It's the arrangement for the year, yes.
Okay, for the year? I'd give you 2 prizes.
He's a homeless preacher.
There's bound to be some benefits there. Well, let me go ahead and say you ain't going to be able to take anything off on travel to work. But, and oh, by the way, that's a good time to mention that. Back and forth to work, to the church building, back and forth to preach, you cannot count. That is considered commuting. That's not. But now if you have to go to the church an extra time for elders meeting or something else, you can do that. But I don't know the answer to that. My initial response would be, because that's technically not a dwelling per se, I would find a hard time trying to figure out how to do that. I would just say you're getting a free gratis benefit of, getting to live in the building and bathe in the baptistry and all that stuff. So, that's, there may be a way. It's above my pay grade, but yes, that I appreciate that question. I hadn't had that before. Yes, sir.
What are some recommendations for filing taxes while
While you're in school, great. And I knew there was something you asked me to remind you of, or remind me about. So, you are full-time students and you get support. And you were telling me that some tax preparer said that support was taxable. From my study and of my knowledge, the support is not, N-O-T, it is not taxable. And let me tell you why I do not believe it is taxable. What is taxable is what you have earned from services that you have provided. Now, the support, again, to my understanding, and this question is a fairly frequent one, the support is a gift. It's a gift. They're not paying you for something that you do. Now, I'll follow that question up with this question. Okay, so congregation XYZ supports me. And periodically I go to congregation XYZ and they want me to preach and give a report, which is a good thing. And then when I go to congregation XYZ and preach, they give me $200 for going and preaching. Is that taxable? The answer, in my observation, is yes. Because what have you done? You've provided them a service. You've done, what would they do for the guy that preached the Sunday before? They would pay him. But let's say they're giving you $2,000 a month for support to come to school. That $2,000 a month is not taxable because they're gifting that to you. They're not paying you for a service. So while you're in school, you may make a little bit money preaching here and there, whatever. I wouldn't count that as a minister. I would treat that on Schedule C. I would pay tax on that. You're probably not going to have any kind of housing allowance or anything like that because you're not working for a single congregation. You would have travel expenses to those places because that's not your regular and ordinary place of worship. So if your spouse works, then obviously you'd need to file that part. If you have children and you make a fairly decent amount just filling in or reporting, things like that, it might help you get some earned income credit and things like that. So it is different in my observation, understanding, if you are in school and just preaching sporadically or as requested versus once you sign on the dotted line and say, I'm going to be the preacher for. So, does that make sense? Yes, sir.
While you're preaching full-time,
Mhm.
if you receive a W-2 or a 1099, and you have kids,
Mhm.
are you still eligible for the earned income?
Absolutely.
With kids?
Yes. Yeah, W-2 or Schedule C, either one, you're still eligible. So, and hold that question, I'll get it, but I kind of want to tie that and tie the other question in too. So, while I'm preaching, I get this W-2, but what about they ask me to come speak at vacation Bible schools and gospel meetings and things like that? That's separate income. You treat it separately. You put it on Schedule C. You can treat your expenses. You can take your expenses off on Schedule C. Obviously, you wouldn't give those to your treasurer because that's not expenses related to that congregation. So most of the time, you're going to have your W-2 from the place where you preach, and then you're going to have a Schedule C for your other income expenses. Does that make sense? And you keep those separate. Yes, sir.
You're talking about mileage.
Mhm.
When is it acceptable, other than commuting to the congregation, when is it acceptable, like maybe a Bible study or maybe getting certain supplies, you have to put that, when is it acceptable to write the mileage down?
Okay, that's a good question, and there's like 12 trillion possibilities, but I'll give it in 3 words, maybe 4 words. Okay, or I'll just give you a sentence. When it is ordinary and or necessary in your course of business. So, you go to the nursing home. That's ordinary, that's necessary. You go to buy supplies. Okay, you can't have them shipped in, but if you go buy them, that's okay too. Everything doesn't have to be bought on Amazon. And just kind of keep those 2 words, ordinary and necessary. Is this something a reasonable person would do to enhance their business or is needful for their business? So you go to another congregation's gospel meeting. Okay, you're encouraging brethren. That's ordinary, that's necessary. So, yes, sir.
I heard from another tax professional that if you have a home office
Mhm.
or if you set up like a PO box and you visit one of those 2 before you commute to work,
Mm-hmm.
that then makes your commute your drive to work, one of those.
Yeah, I would be leery of that. I'm not going to say it's totally wrong. If you, let's just say you did this. Let's say you went from home to the hospital and then to the church building. And I would think you could justify home to the hospital and back. But anytime you're counting the mileage, whatever portion of it's going to the church building, they're going to treat that as commuting. So I would be personally leery of that. You mentioned home. You could set up an office in your home. You can do a home office deduction. I don't normally encourage that either, because you have to get into the thing of part of it is this and part of it is that, and I would more take the utilities, and you have to do percentages, what part of your house is being used for an office, and then you have to do depreciation. And there's a lot of things involved that are not necessarily going to save you a lot of money, may become audit red flags, and you can take most of it off through utilities and other things. But yeah, I would be cautious. I would just do it this way. Commuting, never. Other stuff, and sometimes you're doing it, you go one place, the other. Figure out the most logical and reasonable way to say, okay, I didn't go directly here, 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 and here, but here's where I went, here's what the business purpose was, and you're cool with that. You could in theory call going to the post office to pick up your mail if you have your post office, a business expense. My deal is always this, and I've never had issues with auditors. I'm going to treat the government the same way I want to be treated. I'm not going to push the envelope so far that they're going to go, well, because at the end of the day, they've got discretion, and they can say, I disagree. And then you got to appeal it. So they can smack. But if they see that you're trying to make a good effort, you're trying to be honest with it, and you're not trying to abuse the system. I've had auditors come in my office, not on preacher stuff, but on other stuff, and they ask me basically two questions. Have you seen this stuff? Do you think they're trying to do it right? And I'm like, yeah and yeah. They looked at it 5 minutes, and they were out the door. If they ever suspect that somebody's really trying to, push the envelope as far as they can, then they're going to sit there and they're going to go through every single thing. And they've got 100% authority to go X, 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 X. Now, if they're wrong, you can appeal it, but you really don't go down that trail. So just kind of play the common sense game in that. Say, hey, I'm going to treat the government the way I'd want to be treated. I'll utilize to the fullest, but, and they're gray areas. There's no question. There's no doubt. I just tell people, hey, take whatever, be as aggressive or as lack thereof as you want to be, but, I just always want to be able to justify anything that I was doing and say, I think this is pretty much on trail. Somebody, yes, sir.
You said that when you go, or before you sign any agreement with the congregation, that you should get a good written form about what it looks like when you part ways. So what does that look like?
Okay, not so much when you, well, yeah, okay, I understand what you're saying now. So a part of either a compensation agreement, doesn't have to be, but a part of just a working agreement. They may say, we want you in the office X number of days, da-da-da-da-da, we want you to do X number of whatever. So in a working agreement, you may want something like this. Okay, we agree, as the preacher, I'll agree to give you 60 days notice if I choose to go somewhere else. Okay. That's an act of good faith to say, okay, I'm not just going to come in one Sunday morning and say, I'm leaving, I'll be somewhere else next week. Now, can you modify that? Sure. But then I would also want them to say, okay, if we decide we want another preacher, unless you've done something doctrinally wrong or we just, you've done axe murdered somebody in front of the church building or something, then I'd like 60 days notice as well, where you pay me for 60 days or 90 days or whatever you agree with, but agree on something where you're not just left out in the cold, and they're not just left out in the cold. They don't want to be, you don't get up on Sunday night to close the sermon and say, hey, by the way, I took another job, see y'all later. And then be sitting there waiting on something, needing to find someone. And the same time, if they decide they want to move in another direction, you'd like to have a little time to be able to go and have them pay you through that process too. Good question. Other questions? Comments? I'm sure in a lot of journals tonight or digitally, there's going to be a lot of stuff said about this was the most exciting 3 hours of my life. As it related to taxes and money or something like that. No, just kidding. thank y'all so much for your interest. Thank you most of all for your commitment to the Lord's work. You're at an awesome school. You're doing a great thing. Thank you, wives. You can't do it without the wives. You are the backbone and the foundation that makes this whole thing go. I have cards up here up front. Feel free to get a card. Feel free to contact me if you want some different forms or if I can help you. Feel free to contact Charles. Tell him I told you to call. That'll probably increase your fee by 25%. But but great guy. But I doubt seriously you could get in this tax season, but you could probably get something set up for next tax season. And he's just super good guy. Thank you again. God bless and have a great day. And if you got other questions, I'll be here for a little bit if you just want to ask another question.
I have a question.
Yes. Shoot.
So you live in Alabama. You do a gospel